The night Major Putnam was taken, the forest didn't whisper, it roared. Every sound, every shifting shadow, felt like a living thing closing in on him. He had fought in brutal battles before, had ridden through storms that shattered whole regiments, and had stared down muskets aimed at his chest. But nothing, not even the worst of the French and Indian War, could have prepared him for the terror that began the moment he heard the war cry break through the trees. It was not human, or at least not entirely. It rose and broke and rose again, a chilling promise carried on cold wind. Someone was about to die. Putnam had been traveling ahead of his men, following a set of tracks he believed belonged to a French scouting party. He told himself he was careful. He told himself he was alert. But the forest had its own rules, and on that night, it closed around him like a trap. The last thing he saw before the blow struck the back of his head was a figure dropping from a low branch, eyes reflecting the fire of a small torch like those of a wolf. When he woke, he was tied, stripped of weapons, and surrounded by faces painted in black, red, and white. Their expressions didn't shift, not anger, not triumph, not curiosity. Just a cold assessment, as if they were deciding not whether he would die, but how. The pain in his skull throbbed with each heartbeat. Putnam forced himself not to look weak, even as warm blood trickled down his cheek and dried on his jaw. He'd been taught since boyhood that a soldier's first defense is his composure. But this was no battlefield. The French and Indian War had already shown him horrors he hadn't believed men capable of: villages burned to ash, prisoners taken only to disappear forever, bodies left mutilated in ways only nightmares should know. Now he was the captive. Now he was the one staring into the expressionless silence of his captors. One of the warriors stepped forward, broad-shouldered and tall, with a necklace of carved bone. He lifted Putnam's chin with the tip of a knife, inspecting him as though he were meat. The blade was sharp enough that Putnam felt the metal bite the skin just from the lightest pressure. The warrior grunted something in his language, and the others answered with a murmur that rippled around the circle. Then they dragged Putnam to his feet and forced him to walk. Cold rain began to fall, turning the ground into mud that sucked at his boots. The forest smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Every branch seemed shaped like a claw. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. Putnam stumbled once, twice. On the third time, a warrior jabbed his ribs hard enough that he gasped. But he would not cry out. He would not give them that satisfaction. He didn't know how many hours had passed when they finally reached their camp. It lay in a hollow deep in the woods, hidden beneath a canopy so dense the moonlight barely touched the ground. A large fire crackled in the center, its glow painting the warriors' faces in flickering reds and oranges. Women prepared food, children darted around the edges of the camp, whispering and pointing at him. Some approached cautiously, touching his torn coat, his rough hands, then darting away giggling. He tried not to flinch. He tried not to think about the stories he had heard: captives tortured for days, captives burned alive, captives forced to run gauntlets until they fell unconscious from pain. The men tied him to a stake near the fire, but not close enough to warm him. The rain had soaked him through, and chills clung to his bones. The warrior with the bone necklace crouched beside him, staring silently into Putnam's eyes. His face bore no hatred. Just a calm certainty, as if he already knew what Putnam's fate would be, and it was only a matter of time. Putnam swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "If you mean to kill me," he said quietly, "do it quickly." The warrior blinked once, slowly. Then he smiled, a small, unsettling smile that conveyed nothing comforting. He stood and walked away. Putnam's breath caught. He had spoken bravely, but inside, a cold fear crept through him like smoke, filling his chest, his lungs, even the space behind his eyes. Quick death was not their way. He knew that. Everyone knew that. The night dragged on with awful slowness. The fire crackled. Men spoke quietly among themselves. The shadows seemed to sway like dancers around him. His wrists burned from the ropes that bit into his skin. His legs ached. Hunger gnawed at him, though it hardly mattered. Fear had already taken up most of the space inside him. Sometime past midnight, the warriors gathered in a circle around him. Their chief stepped forward, raising a carved staff. The murmuring quieted. The fire seemed to grow taller, brighter. Putnam felt the heat on his face, too hot now, as though the flames were leaning toward him. The chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant, though Putnam understood none of the words. But he felt their meaning. The fire, the rope, the sharp tools hanging at their belts, the anticipation in the air. They were preparing something ceremonial. Something meant to break him. Two warriors untied him just long enough to strip away the rest of his wet clothing, leaving him shivering in the cold night air. They retied him to the stake, spreading his arms wide. The camp fell silent. Even the wind stilled. Putnam clenched his jaw. He would not beg. He would not scream. The first blow came from a blunt club that struck his shoulder, jarring him so hard his teeth clacked together. The second landed on his ribs. A roar went up from the surrounding warriors, not angry but ritualistic. Each blow came from a different attacker, men testing him, measuring him, seeing what pain he could take. They stopped only when he sagged against the ropes, gasping for breath. His vision blurred. He tasted blood. The chief approached again, dipping his fingers into a bowl filled with ash and something sticky, sap, perhaps. He traced strange symbols across Putnam's chest, as though marking him for something. Then he stepped back. Warriors began to chant. The fire blazed higher. Someone tossed a handful of something into the flames, herbs that sent up thick, sweet-smelling smoke. It curled around Putnam's face, invading his lungs, dizzying him. He saw movement to his left. A warrior approached carrying a torch. Putnam braced himself. This was it, the burning, the agony, the end of everything. He closed his eyes, ready for the fire to touch his skin. But it didn't. Instead, the warrior held the torch close, just close enough that the heat seared the hairs on Putnam's arms, but not enough to burn. They were taunting him, testing him, seeing how long he would last before he broke. The torch drifted lower, hovering near his side. The pain of the heat alone made him grit his teeth so hard he tasted iron. Sweat broke across his forehead though the air around him was freezing. Another warrior stepped forward with a knife, not to cut him free, but to slice shallow lines across his skin. Each small cut stung sharply, and the cold air made it worse. Blood welled and dripped slowly. The cuts weren't deep enough to threaten his life. They were meant for suffering. Then someone pulled him forward by the hair and forced his face close to the fire. The smoke made his eyes water uncontrollably. His skin prickled with heat. The flames seemed to reach toward him like living hands. Just when he thought they would shove his face into the fire, they let go, laughing, not cruel laughter, but ritual laughter, as if this were all a test he was expected to fail. Putnam hung limp against the post, trembling, every nerve raw. The world around him seemed distant, muffled, as though he were underwater. He didn't know how long they tormented him. Minutes, hours. Time had dissolved somewhere between the chanting and the pain. At last, the chief raised his staff again. The warriors stepped back. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Putnam forced himself to lift his head. He had survived the first round, but he sensed it wasn't mercy. It was simply the beginning. They had marked him, tested him, wounded him. Now they would decide what came next. The chief approached him once more, looking into his eyes with that same calm certainty. He tapped his staff lightly against Putnam's chest, right over his heart. The meaning was clear. The suffering was far from over. It had only begun. Putnam barely remembered falling asleep, but exhaustion eventually dragged him under. The cold ground, the ropes, the ache in every bone couldn't keep his body from shutting down after the ordeal. When he woke, dawn was barely breaking, casting pale streaks of light through the dense canopy. The camp was quiet, but not entirely still. A few warriors tended the fire, others sharpened blades or prepared hides. Smoke drifted lazily upward. The world looked deceptively calm. Then he realized he could no longer feel his hands. The ropes had tightened overnight, and the lack of circulation had turned his fingers numb. He tried to flex them and winced. The cuts across his chest had dried into painful crusts. His ribs throbbed. His shoulder burned with each breath. His stomach growled, but the hunger was faint, distant, the kind of hunger that came after fear had drained most of the body's energy. A shadow fell over him. The warrior with the bone necklace stood before him again, staring with unreadable eyes. He held a small wooden bowl in one hand. Steam rose from it, mingling with the morning air. Putnam braced himself, unsure if it was food or something far worse. The warrior dipped his fingers in the bowl and reached forward. Putnam flinched as the warm liquid touched his wounds, yet it wasn't painful. In fact, it soothed the burning. A mixture of herbs and something like animal fat spread across his bruises and cuts. The warrior worked with surprising gentleness, smoothing the paste over each injury. It cooled the heat of inflammation and eased the throbbing. Putnam didn't understand. Last night they had beaten him, tormented him, threatened to burn him alive. Now they were healing him. Then it struck him. They were tending to him so he could endure more. The realization chilled him deeper than the night air ever could. When the warrior finished, he stepped back without a sound, leaving Putnam bound and confused. The forest around him brightened as the sun climbed higher. More warriors emerged from their lodges. Children played. Women ground corn, stirred pots over small fires, or stretched hides on wooden frames. Life in the camp continued as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. But every so often, someone glanced toward Putnam, not with curiosity but with expectation. As though they were waiting. As though the next stage of his suffering was already planned. By midday, the chief returned. He studied Putnam for a long moment before gesturing to several warriors. They untied him from the stake, only to bind his wrists again and drag him deeper into the forest. Putnam stumbled along the uneven ground, the forest swallowing them whole. The air grew colder. The trees loomed taller. The silence felt heavier. They walked for what seemed like hours, until at last they reached a clearing where the sunlight poured down freely, illuminating a circle of stones in a large wooden frame. Putnam's heart pounded as he realized what the frame was. A rack. He had heard stories, captives stretched until joints cracked, ribs dislocated, bodies left hanging in agonizing positions for days. His stomach twisted. Sweat broke across his skin. Two warriors seized him by the arms, lifting him bodily onto the wooden structure. They tied his wrists to the top and his ankles to the bottom. The ropes were thick and coarse, biting into his raw skin. He tried to remain calm. He tried to slow his breathing. But fear rose like a tide, impossible to fight. He tested the ropes, not to escape, but to understand the limits of his confinement. They were impossibly tight. The chief stepped forward, examining him again. Then he gestured to the warrior with the bone necklace. The warrior took hold of a lever attached to the rack. Putnam sucked in a breath. The lever turned. Pain exploded through his shoulders as his arms were stretched upward. His muscles screamed in protest. The ropes pulled tighter, digging into bone and tendon. He clenched his teeth until his jaw ached. The lever turned again. His back arched. His wrists burned. His ankles felt as though they would snap. The tendons along his sides stretched like drawn wires. His breath came in ragged gasps. The chief watched him passively, silent as stone. The lever turned a third time. This time Putnam couldn't hold back the cry that escaped him. His body felt as though it were tearing apart. White-hot pain seared through every nerve. His vision blurred with tears. He tried to blink away. The warriors paused, observing him with the clinical detachment of men studying an animal. One of them touched the rope at his wrist, checking its tension. Another pressed firmly against his ribs, watching his reaction. Then the lever turned again. Putnam bit down a scream. His jaw trembled. His fingernails dug into his own palms until they broke the skin. Every muscle in his body quivered uncontrollably. Sweat poured down his face. He didn't know how long they stretched him, minutes, hours, a lifetime. The pain blurred time into something meaningless. The forest around him spun. Birds cried overhead. The sun beat down mercilessly. At last, the chief raised his hand, and the warrior stopped turning the lever. Putnam sagged in the ropes, trembling, gasping, unable to move. Relief washed through him in shaky waves, though the pain still radiated from every limb. He prayed they would stop. He prayed they would be done with him. But suffering was not over. Two warriors approached with long wooden rods. They struck his thighs, his calves, his arms, sharp, stinging blows that sent fresh jolts of agony through his overstretched muscles. He couldn't even twist to avoid them. The rack held him completely immobile. They struck him again, and again. Each blow was deliberate, measured. They weren't trying to kill him. They were inflicting pain in a careful, controlled way. The kind of pain that breaks a man from the inside out. Putnam couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every sound, every movement felt distant, as though he were sinking beneath deep water. When the blows finally stopped, he hung limp, feeling barely human. His whole body shook with uncontrollable tremors. His breathing came in harsh, shallow gasps. Then, to his confusion, they released him. His limbs collapsed beneath him the moment the ropes loosened. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting up his spine. He couldn't lift his arms, they felt like they no longer belonged to him. Warriors hauled him upright, supporting his weight as if he were a child learning to walk. They half-dragged him back to the camp. Children watched curiously. Women paused their work to look at him. He felt their eyes on him, not with cruelty but with a solemn understanding. He was a part of their ritual now. They tied him again near the fire, giving him water this time, and a small piece of roasted meat. His body resisted swallowing at first, but he forced it down. Every breath hurt. Every movement sent sparks of pain through his joints. Night fell slowly, shadows stretching long and thin across the camp. The fire crackled. Men spoke in low tones. Putnam drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure if time was passing or standing still. His mind wandered. He thought of his regiment. He thought of his home. Of his wife's face. Of the warmth of a hearth and the smell of bread baking. He had survived battles that wiped out entire companies. He had led men through ambushes where muskets fired so close their barrels burned faces. He had escaped death more times than any man had the right to. But this was different. This was a slow unmaking. The chief returned at midnight. He sat before Putnam, cross-legged, silent. The firelight flickered over his painted face. He studied Putnam for a long time, eyes dark and thoughtful. Then he spoke softly, one word, repeated twice. Putnam didn't know the language, but he understood the tone. Respect. Endurance. The chief nodded once, stood, and walked away. Putnam didn't understand fully until morning came, when the warriors untied him from the stake but didn't bind him again. They gestured for him to follow them. Weak, trembling, barely able to stand, Putnam rose. They led him through the forest, farther and farther, until the sound of water reached his ears. A river. Wide and rushing. A canoe waited on the bank. The warrior with the bone necklace gestured toward it, then toward the eastern horizon. Go. Freedom. Putnam stared, stunned, unable to speak. He didn't know why. He didn't know what had changed. Maybe he had passed their test. Maybe they believed his endurance proved something worth honoring. Maybe they simply no longer wished to keep him. Whatever the reason, they let him go. Putnam stepped into the canoe. The warrior pushed it into the current. The river seized it, carrying him away. He looked back once. The warrior raised his hand. A gesture of acknowledgement. A gesture between two men who had seen each other at the edge between life and death. As the river carried him toward safety, toward his own people, Putnam realized something he would remember for the rest of his life. His body had been battered. His pride had been broken. His spirit had been pushed to its limits. But he had survived. And survival, in that dark and brutal wilderness, was its own kind of victory.